Who would read a collection of familiar quotations?
From beginning to end, yeah. That's,
The answer is us, dear friends.
That's right.
We did that. We did that.
Good job.
Welcome to Cross Connections, Season 2, Cover to Cover, as we read along with you each week and discuss the Bible from Genesis to Revelation. Cover to Cover is hosted by
Rick Morley.
Elliot Van Hoy.
and Natalie Hill. Join us as we discover how these stories connect us to God, to our inner selves, and to one another in a world that tries so hard to disconnect us. Welcome back, one and all. We are still in the books of wisdom. Today we bring you Proverbs.
This is Elliot's favorite book.
Oh, I love it. Read it every day. No.
It's a book of aphorisms. If you like aphorisms,
This one's for you.
this one's for you. An apple a day keeps the doctor away. Do you have a favorite aphorism that's not from the Bible?
Oh, man.
Oh, what's the early bird gets the worm? That's a good one.
Right? So aphorisms, proverbs, wisdom sayings. And as the book I was reading to kind of help prep me for this book of the Bible, the How to Read the Bible book by book says, as with the book of Psalms, reading through the book of Proverbs is not the ordinary way of handling the Proverbs. Who would read a collection of familiar quotations?
From beginning to end, yeah. That's,
The answer is us, dear friends.
That's
we
right.
we
do
did that. We did that.
Good job.
We were talking before we came on about how it's interesting when the Gideons, the Gideon Bible Society that puts Bibles in hotels, and they have little versions of the Bible they hand out. That's not the entire Bible. The little ones have the New Testament, but then also the Psalms and the Proverbs.
Right.
And like of all books to include in your little tiny shortened form of the Bible, to include Proverbs, and then to include Psalms too.
Totally.
Two
Right.
books that were not just intended to be read from beginning to end, but are more compendiums. It's just kind of wild and
strange.
Well, and we talked so much about the Psalms and how they would have been used by those of the Jewish faith coming up, by Jesus and his contemporaries, and how they were really integrated into their life, and that you see references back to some of those Psalms in the Gospels. Tell me about the Proverbs. Do we see much of the Proverbs coming back around? I don't know that I can think of a moment when a proverb came back around the same way. So I can see including the Psalms because of that influence. But the Proverbs,
I think this isn't a direct answer to your question, but maybe just additional context for folks. We talked about the Psalms as being traditionally attributed to David. Obviously, it's very clear they have a kind of liturgical role in Jewish worship. They were often set to music or chanting. They were probably often used in the temple. Proverbs is very different in that this is everyday, concrete kind of, like you said, aphorisms, knowledge. The early bird gets the worm. This is things that are often considered common sense to some people. And I think thinking about getting used elsewhere in the Bible, these were written pretty late. This is not like really ancient material. And so a lot of the Bible, the Old Testament, the Hebrew Bible, has already been written and compiled at this point. So that's a factor as well, right? Like this is not really ancient literature.
so now the Proverbs are often attributed largely to Solomon.
Right.
And in my NRSV, sometimes it would say that, these are from Solomon, or these are from Solomon via Hezekiah, who's much later. Hezekiah's scribes wrote them down or rewrote them or edited them, something about that. Can we talk a little bit about the origin of these Psalms? These Proverbs, they're just so different than some of the other texts that we've had so far. And then
think,
there's
Rick?
a few, like chapter 30 was attributed to Augur, who I couldn't figure out where he's from elsewise, and then 31 to Lemuel. I think I'm pronouncing that right.
Oh, yeah. Good point. I forgot about that. Yeah.
the book does have a structure to it. And it's not just random aphorisms. So there's a first part, I think it's the first 9 chapters, is it?
Yeah.
Is this discourse between like a father teaching their child. And you get that, you can just see that discourse right in there. And then
Sons in particular. I think
I was trying to be.
So says. Well, but
Yeah.
but there's a reason why I think that makes a difference.
Oh, I think I see where you're going.
Well, interesting, Natalie. What makes you say that? Because at least in my translation, unless there's a note about the NRSV making it more gender neutral, each chapter begins with my child. So take, for example, to Rick's point about this breakdown, chapter 1 starts with this whole book, right, is the Proverbs of Solomon. Verse 2 clearly tells you what the book's for learning about wisdom and instruction. And then when you get into chapter 2, it's my child, if you accept my words. Chapter 3, my child, do not forget my teaching. Chapter 4, listen, children, to a father's instruction. Chapter 5, my child, be attentive to my wisdom. Chapter 6, my child, if you have given your pledge to your neighbor. Chapter 7, my child, keep my words. And then chapter 8 and 9 are still kind of about a father and child, but it transitions to this moment of wisdom. And we see a clear break or a new section in chapter 10, which begins with the kind of heading, the Proverbs of Solomon, and then we get into this kind of doublet structure of the way a proverb is traditionally understood. But it may be the case that the NRSV has made maybe a Hebrew word for a son into a gender neutral term. So I don't know if that's the case.
First of all, the introduction that I have it says that the original audience of Proverbs was primarily young men preparing for adult responsibilities.
Yes.
A male-centered perspective prevails in the book.
Yes.
It also goes on under chapter 1, verse 8. It says, my child, literally my son, a typical usage of the sages when referring to the teacher-student relationship. So you think about when, you can imagine Plato and Aristotle and my child. But you're really addressing.
Yes, this is a patriarchal society.
It's a
let's be clear.
Let's be clear. Further, the entire text goes on to use personification of wisdom and wisdom's antitheses as women.
Yes, right. So it's a very gendered book.
It's a very gendered book.
Yeah.
Absolutely is.
My very literal translation uses son.
Okay,
throughout.
nice.
Oh, okay.
So it probably is a recognition that this word is very much addressing sons.
Yeah. I mean, and remember, it's wild to say this in 2025, but it's not until very recently in human history that women were even open. The education was available to women,
right?
At least in the same way.
Well, not to mention even in our own text, right? That women are not viewed as property in some sense. I mean, through marriage, levirate marriage, right? Like there is some, and our text oftentimes tries to break that open, but that is the society, the world that these texts were written within. Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yep. That's a great point, Natalie. And I think it's worth saying, because we'll get more of this as we get into the prophets, the personification, the imagery, the metaphor used of unfaithfulness to God, right, is always a prostitute. And that in its own way is a very...
Or adultery.
Adultery. It's there's problems with
But
this
Israel
imagery.
is always the woman,
yes.
the promiscuous woman.
Right.
And
so the idea, even that very simple binary of like, what is like a morally bad thing is a promiscuous woman, right? Like they don't say you do get a morally bad thing is like a man that commits injustice, but like it definitely genders this in a really problematic way.
And why is a promiscuous woman so dangerous? Because she is the childbearer. And so all property and rights and whatever, whomever owns the woman owns the whatever else.
Right.
And the idea that she might actually own herself is a whole other concept for this.
Yep.
But that's why, because one must, in a patriarchal society, one must control the woman to control property, inheritance, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera.
Right. And so we're still dealing with a world that's just so different than ours.
Yeah, very much.
Thank goodness.
Yeah,
thank goodness.
very
it's different
much
in those ways.
Yeah.
So this is, before we got on, Rick and I both jokingly were talking about how much we dislike the book of Proverbs just as a whole. Yeah. And maybe some of the listeners are feeling that.
You ask people all the time, like, which favorite book, which book would you take out? This is my number. I don't even have to think about it. It's
100%.
Proverbs.
Yeah, there's a few reasons we've already mentioned that would be the case. Is there another reason, Rick, that this is like one you really don't like?
So I will eventually, probably in the next episode, get to Ecclesiastes, which is also wisdom literature, which can also have a sort of some aphorisms in it. But Ecclesiastes is far more real.
Yeah.
And Proverbs is very, it's kind of sometimes trite.
Simplistic.
Simplistic. It's on the surface. It's dealing with a world that makes sense. And quite frankly, we live in a world that just doesn't make sense a lot of the time.
Right.
Just turn on the news.
Yeah, right.
And make sense of it for me.
Right.
And you're not going to be able to. And so Proverbs sometimes just doesn't work.
Yeah,
And
right.
so I just have a hard time.
So flesh that out for someone that might be new to some of this stuff. What is the view of Proverbs that is very simple? Like, how does it view the world in simplistic terms?
In some ways, it kind of goes back to the Deuteronomistic historian, that good things happen to people who are good.
Right.
Bad things happen to people who are bad. And what determines whether you are good or whether you're bad is whether you are connected to God or not. And so the good, God-fearing people are, have wonderful things happen to them,
right.
And they end up being the wise. And the whole book's about wisdom being connected to your relationship with God.
Right.
Yeah, in chapter 1, they kind of set it up in chapter 1, verse 7. The fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge. Fools despise wisdom and instruction.
Yep, and that sets the tone for the whole book. I mean,
right.
It's a book about wisdom, and that's what it's about.
Right. And following wisdom leads to prospering. Not following wisdom leads to folly and destruction, right?
Yep.
So it's very much this like two paths kind of structure of here's the path of wisdom, here's the path of like foolishness. If you follow one of these two paths, this is what will happen to you.
Whereas in Ecclesiastes and in the book of Job, two other wisdom literature books, there's a realization that, terrible things just sometimes happen.
Yes, right.
And there's a randomness to life.
Yes.
And why did this thing happen to me? Well, I don't know.
Yes.
It's not because I was a good person or a bad person or a faithful person or an unfaithful person. And
right.
So Job and Ecclesiastes are able to look at the world with more of a nuance and a complexity.
Right.
Whereas Proverbs is just sort of like, it's just simple. And
Yeah, you look at the world today and you say to yourself, gee, if these Proverbs were true, things would be a little different looking than they are. Because you watch people who are foolish and scoffers of wisdom by the standards of Proverbs, and they seem to be doing just fine.
Right.
At least right now.
I mean, if you do look at it as a book, the first 9 chapters, either a parent or a teacher addressing a son, a child, if this is for child consumption, if this is for the education of minors, okay, that makes sense.
Right.
We typically present the world as simpler than it is to people who are younger because we're just not ready to get into all the complexities of life.
And then it gives them a framework to then
right. And then later we lay on the harder, more complex things that we can't really understand or easily describe.
Yes.
And so if that's where we're coming from in Proverbs, okay, then I can maybe get on board with it a little more. But I would rather stick with Job and Ecclesiastes if I had to go to the wisdom literature myself.
Right. Yeah. I think one thing that's interesting to note about this wisdom literature, and this is something we've said about the Old Testament in general, but people may have forgotten, is that the Old Testament, by and large, does not have a strong understanding of life after death or of resurrection. This actually begins to develop in the prophets and then really develops after the prophets in what would be called the intertestamental period, kind of between when the close of the Old Testament takes place and the New Testament is written. And I think what's interesting about something like Proverbs and something like Ecclesiastes is they're both trying to deal with death in different ways, life and death in different ways. And so, for example, in Proverbs, you talked about, Rick, right? Like there's this recognition of wisdom and relationship with God. And part of what this is doing is saying, if you follow this wisdom, you will lead a flourishing long life, because that is actually the goal of a life for someone in ancient Israel. Like there isn't yet really this recognition, this revelation of this sense of there is hope, right? And so take Proverbs 4, for example. Proverbs 4:10, the father says to the son, "Hear, my child, and accept my words, this wisdom I'm giving to you, that the years of your life may be many."
Yeah.
And that's really like when you're living in this period where you don't have this strong sense of hope for resurrection, the goal of life is to live life really well. What's interesting, to your point, Rick, is when we get to Ecclesiastes, death actually is what subverts this framework, because it's like, well, if the wise and the righteous can die, and they can die at any point randomly, then how could this be true? Wisdom doesn't lead to a long, flourishing life, which is just another interesting way of saying this is actually part of the context, the cultural situation in which the hope of resurrection enters into. And so that's just an interesting context for some of this wisdom literature. They're trying to deal with death and life in very different ways.
Yeah, in a very different way than has typically been talked about in the Christian faith, where it's not so much of Christianity. What passes as sort of like mainstream Christianity is not about just like a better life today.
Right.
It's about what's coming next. Like when you're driving out into central Pennsylvania and you see the big billboards, it's like, where are you going? Are you going to heaven? Right. Like that is not even on the radar
at all.
For Proverbs or Ecclesiastes.
Yep, not at all.
Right.
Yeah, that's a great point. I think
they're just trying to make this time right here now matter as much.
Yeah,
Right.
It's like, what do you do in life right now given X circumstances, right? So it's
the most important thing is a full life.
Yes,
here, a good life here.
Yes, and when I don't want to jump ahead, but when we get to Ecclesiastes, the author of Ecclesiastes deals with this very differently. It's like, actually, you just need to enjoy your work. You need to enjoy the things in front of you. Enjoy your friends.
Eat, drink,
be
merry.
Really?
Yeah, I know.
Yeah.
I know. It's
very different. Very different. But the one thing I want to say about Proverbs on this reread for me that struck me was the way that wisdom is connected to justice. And so in chapter 1, right, this is the Proverbs of Solomon, verse 2. This is for learning about wisdom and instruction. So it gives us its thesis statement right there. And then when you get to verse 3, what do we use this wisdom for? It says, for gaining instruction in wise dealing, righteousness, justice, and equity. And I think what really struck me is you actually see this play out across these first 9 chapters, that wisdom, it's deeper than technical knowledge or abstract knowledge or degrees or scientific knowledge, right? Like this is some type of knowledge that helps us to live more just, righteous, equitable lives. And that was really powerful, I think, for me to see on this read, because like Rick, I'm not the biggest fan of Proverbs. Sometimes I don't like the ideology of it. It's very often used, especially the latter half of Proverbs, by prosperity teachers, like plant your seed and water it and it will grow and God will give you riches, right?
Really easy, right?
But yeah, like that's actually missing the deeper wisdom that Proverbs is concerned with, which is justice, and the way that we want to be formed into the type of people that have an awareness of justice and righteousness in the world and are trying to lead lives that bring more justice and righteousness into the world.
In chapter 14, verse 21, one who despises a neighbor is a wrongdoer, but one who is gracious to the humble, he has blessings. Verse 31, one who oppresses a poor person reviles his maker, but one who is gracious to a needy person honors him. So like there is a sense of like that wisdom is not just, this is not an intellectual exercise, but it's about improving your life. And in some way, in real tangible ways, improving the lives of people around you. Which is why wisdom here is not about being smart. And, I love smart people. That's why I love doing this podcast with the two of you and all of our incredibly smart listeners out there. They're all just like brainiacs, obviously, listening to us. But that's that's not what wisdom is. Wisdom is, it's rooted right in the first, chapter about the connection with God, but also with it's a deeper way of living than just knowing stuff. And I love this because we all know people who are smart. They have degrees.
Yep.
They have done things in their lives, and then oh my gosh, we like scratch our heads like, why did they say that?
Right.
Why did they do that? What were they thinking? They're such a smart person. Well, it's not because
they're so smart. This is what they're doing with their time and their life and their
right.
whatever.
Right. But the problem isn't their smarts. The problem is their wisdom. Right.
Yeah. Yeah. I think that connection, we've talked about this before, of for the Israelites, for the Hebrew people, the Hebrew language, there is a difference between the heart and the head.
Yeah.
And wisdom is not a head.
Oh, that's such
it's
a
not
good-
a head
That's
thing.
right.
That's such a good way of explaining it.
Yeah, like it's
Circumcised heart.
Yeah, it is. And I'm glad you brought up circumcised heart, because Proverbs 3:5, trust in the Lord with all your heart and do not rely on your own insight.
Yeah.
Like, what a clear way of saying this isn't about intellectual knowledge, though that is certainly a part of this. It's like you said, Rick, it's so much deeper than that.
Yeah.
So yeah, I think that's a really good connection.
Speaking of words, we were being brought back to the very beginning, the kind of the thesis of this. The fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge. Can we talk about the word fear here? Because I've begun to notice, and I think maybe it started in Psalms, or maybe it was in Job somewhere. I was like, I don't think we're talking about fear, the word, as having the same definition as I would assume the definition of fear to be in 2025. We're not talking about like the way I feel when I watch a horror film.
No, what we're thinking about is something that is closer to awe and reverence. I really think this is an artifact of Old English. Your King James or even older Bibles will have a lot of fearing in them, and that's entered into like the religious zeitgeist. And unfortunately, people still read that. They read those same word today, but with an entirely different meaning. I think 500 years ago, our forebears would have understood what the fear of the Lord meant, and it didn't mean to cower under your bed.
Yeah, they weren't scared of God.
Right.
Right.
But awe of God is something you see throughout the scriptures, and it's a healthy spiritual. When Jesus speaks about faith, he oftentimes speaks about the opposite of faith, not being faithlessness, but about being fear. In fact, he's always telling
a great point.
his people, do not be afraid, do not fear not. And so we're called to step away from fear, but awe's good.
So are we looking at two different words? Like, so the word fear shows up here in Proverbs, and the word fear, or do not be afraid, shows up in the Gospels. Is that word actually different in its original Hebrew or Greek?
That's a great question that I don't know.
I'm just curious.
Something for our readers to look into further.
Yeah.
Send us a note.
I think one thing I want to say about this fear component is I think it's a question I get a lot. I brought this up from young people is this. I actually think this sentiment in Proverbs is one of the most offensive sentiments in the entire Old Testament to many young people, is this idea of why would I fear God, right? I thought I'm supposed to love God. And I think that's really great, Rick, to connect it to what Jesus says about not being afraid. That helps us frame this. I think one thing to think about with the fear of God here in Proverbs is I'm connecting it in my mind to what happens when many people in the Bible encounter the presence of God or encounter a divine angelic kind of messenger. And often their first response is fear.
Scared.
Fear.
Overwhelmed.
Very much overwhelmed. They're very worried. And I think,
which is why the first words out of an angel's mouth are
always
do not be afraid.
Do not be afraid.
Old Testament, New Testament, do not be afraid.
Right.
No, it's okay.
Yes. And so I think that helps us situate this fear. But I think it also reminds us that God is very different from us. And that is actually a good thing, right? God is very other.
Yeah.
God is not a creation of human hands or a creation of human imagination, and that is a good thing. And there is a fear that comes with something that is very different from us.
And I have to say, any of the visions of God that humanity creates and creates all the times, those are scary.
Those are actually scary, right?
We don't
Yes.
like what we don't understand. In fact, it scares us.
That's a great
And
reference.
This monster is mysterious, at least.
Yeah.
Sorry, that's from
Wow.
Beauty and the Beast.
Yeah.
It's
Wow.
the most meaningful set of lyrics in a Disney. One of the most meaningful set of lyrics in a Disney film I've ever encountered.
But see, I think that's a healthier way of understanding this fear of we are often afraid initially of things that are different than ourselves.
Yeah.
And we should have in some sense, a healthy fear of just how different God is from us.
Not
and
one that sends us off trying to kill God.
No. Yeah, right.
like in Kill the Beast and Beauty and the
No.
Beast. But
So something for listeners to think about. Another way to frame this.
Speaking of, I'm going to use that as a pivot here a little bit to God is other. And there's in chapter 8, we have, so wisdom is personified as a woman. And we've talked about this. We're talking to sons here a lot, but we're talking about wisdom, and wisdom is personified as a woman. In fact, there's several women that are personified throughout the book of Proverbs. And the words for wisdom, kokma in Hebrew and Sophia in Greek, are both feminine words. It's why you might have a friend named Sophia. And it just means wisdom. Or so in verse 22, this is Sophia, kokma, wisdom speaking. Yahweh acquired me at the beginning of his way, before his actions of old. Long ago I was formed, at the beginning, at earth's origins. When there were no deeps, I was birthed. When there were no springs heavy with water. Before the mountains were settled, before the hills, I was birthed. And it just goes on from there about all the things that happened after she was brought forth.
Right.
And I have there's my own note in right next to verse 23 there. It says John chapter 1. It's so similar to how particularly John, but in other places of the New Testament, speak of Jesus as having been there since the beginning of the world. And I'm not the only one that's noticed this. There's did we talk in our John episode about logos and logos theology? Did we talk about that?
I think we did some, yes.
Logos, in the beginning was the Word, and the
Yep.
Word was with God, and that the word for word, I know it's hard,
Yeah.
is logos. And it's this Greek concept, and it means like the blueprints of everything that makes sense in the world, how the world should be. And John is saying that that's Jesus. And there's Christians have made a connection between what the Word is and Jesus and what Sophia is here, and said that, and wondered, is this Sophia also Christ?
Right. Right.
Or is this Sophia the Holy Spirit?
Yeah.
So part of the connection is with John, but this is also very reminiscent of the language that Paul uses for Christ. So Colossians 1:15, right, is talking about Jesus, and it says Jesus is the image of the invisible God, the firstborn of all creation. In him, all things in heaven and on earth were created, things visible and invisible.
Yeah.
And so again, the early Christians were like, oh, this sounds really similar to
Yeah,
Proverbs
sounds
8.
like Proverbs 8.
Yeah. So there's definitely a connection there. And this was a really big question, as Rick brought up a few sermons ago in the Council of Nicaea, and the question between certain groups of Christians, and there was a certain group called Arians that wanted to say, well, no, look, if this is Jesus, Jesus was created, right? Because that's what Proverbs 8 says. So we're getting into very thorny theological territory here.
Actually, both Arius and Athanasius, the two leads of the two sides opposing each other, both used Proverbs chapter 8 as proof texts that they were correct.
Right.
Arius is like, look right here, it says he was created. And I forget exactly how Athanasius used it, but Athanasius used it as well.
That's very interesting.
So
It is fascinating. But yeah, so this is this chapter has a long history in Christian interpretation and theology.
And what's the big historic church in Constantinople, Istanbul? Come on.
Oh,
Hagia
Sophia.
Sophia?
Yeah, Hagia Sophia.
Sophia.
Yeah.
Yeah. Holy wisdom.
Yes, that's right.
That's right.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's a good one. Good reference.
That'd be a cool visit.
It's on my bucket list.
We'll do a listener sponsored trip. They will.
We'll have to sell. We're going to have to sell some
anyone
merch.
would
Exactly.
like to sponsor that, I've seen where little Jesus has been going.
We're going to need to sell a lot of Gird Your Loins t-shirts to
Seriously.
do our episode in Hagia Sophia.
A lot of Deadhead T-shirts with the Dead Sea Scrolls.
Yes. Get your merch.
Well, I don't know if there's
goodness.
too much more to
You
say
had a
about
resource
Proverbs.
that I'm interested in hearing a
Yeah,
little bit
so
about.
this is a great book called, just for the Old Testament in general, I may have referenced it before, Getting Involved with God, Rediscovering the Old Testament by Ellen F. Davis. And she was, I don't know if she still is, or if she's retired, she's older, a professor at Duke Divinity School. And this is just a really helpful book. It's very readable. It's probably 175 pages.
Oh, wow.
And it has really good chapters on the wisdom literature, on Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, Song of Songs. Very helpful. And she has some good commentary on the book of Proverbs that was kind of bringing me around a little bit.
All right.
She gives a more positive assessment of Proverbs than I think we've maybe given on this podcast, and what it can teach us modern people, that there is some ancient wisdom here. So definitely recommend that one to listeners. That's Getting Involved with God by Ellen Davis. Pretty good.
Cool.
Very readable. Not academic, not heady. Speaking of, heady knowledge, this is much more rooted in kind of, here's the wisdom of these texts and how they can shape us into people whose lives are formed by the wisdom of these various texts. She does a really good job about that. Yeah.
What would it be like to be formed by the book of Proverbs?
That's a good question.
One thing I know is that Proverbs 31 is not a punch list of a to-do list for women.
Right.
So I just want to throw that
Not
out
for,
there.
For a capable wife, it is.
Oh, you're going to get in trouble,
But
Rick.
again, so are we talking about a real human being here, or are we talking about wisdom as a woman? We can get into this. That's the one thing I want to throw in when we're going to talk about Proverbs. It's not something I grew up with, but I grew up in the UCC, American Baptist sort of background. But my understanding is that the idea of the Proverbs 31 woman has in some Christian religious circles been used as a bit of a cudgel against women.
Right.
As this is what you're supposed to do. This is your punch list for who to be, how to be, what you have to have achieved in order to be the perfect woman. And just like a gentle reminder that that's not the audience of this piece of text.
Yeah.
Another really interesting thing I discovered is that bit, that's attributed to King Lemuel as wisdom from the queen mother, basically the king's mother to him. But that section's also an acrostic poem. So it's one of those, it goes through using the Hebrew alphabet.
Yeah.
From the beginning to the end of the Hebrew alphabet, every line starts with the next letter of the alphabet. So, it's kind of being forced into a particular poetic format, which we can't see replicated here
Right.
because we're not seeing it written in Hebrew. And what I will say is that Rachel Held Evans has some really great things that she's written about this. You can find them, may she rest in peace. You can find them still existing on her blog or in her books. A Year of Biblical Womanhood was a great resource for talking about the Proverbs 31 woman. And she she references a friend of hers, a Jewish friend of hers, where in their tradition, it's the men who memorize that piece of scripture as a way to celebrate women, not as a way to take women down or to hold them up against this thing, but as a way to say how praiseworthy women are for all of the wonderful things that they do. So just
I love that.
want to toss that out there. And this is the origin of the Women of Valor thing that Rachel Held Evans would do, and how she used to use that with her friends, and Women of Valor has become kind of a thing because the Proverbs 31 woman is referred to as a woman of valor, but so is Ruth. And Ruth is referred to that way before she's done anything at all, like any of the stuff that the Proverbs 31 woman
That's awesome.
is doing. She's referred to that way when she is destitute, pulling things out of a field with no family.
Yeah.
She is already seen as a woman of valor. So that's the other thing to kind of hold up in tension, again, as we like to do with our scripture. We're holding all of these things together and not just kind of looking at only the one thing or the other.
Amen. Amen.
Rachel Held Evans was a theologian, young woman, young mother, incredible writer. I think
An Episcopalian, joined the Episcopal Church.
She did. She grew up in an evangelical tradition
context, yeah.
and found her way to the Episcopal Church.
Yeah, she
before
grew up.
she died.
She grew up in the town where the
Schofield
monkey
trials.
trial was.
Yeah.
And her first book, I'm just pulling this out of the ether, is about growing up in that sort of milieu, and
It was growing up in Monkey Town or
growing
something
up in
like that.
it's exactly
I think
what
it's
it
called,
is.
yeah.
Yeah. And she was remarkable, and then she tragically died way too young.
Right.
But her works are still reverberating.
Well, definitely check that out. That's a great resource.
There you go. All right. Well, I think we've hit the proverbial end of the
The
line.
The proverbial. Oh,
think we have.
Man.
I had to.
Some mom humor.
Too good.
Thank you all for bearing with us. As usual, enjoy the Proverbs and enjoy the rest of our wisdom literature.
See you next week.
Bye now.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Cross Connections Cover to Cover. New episodes drop each Wednesday. Please be sure to follow or like us on your favorite podcasting app to find us easily each week, or join us on our email list at stdavidschurch.org/crossconnections. If you have questions for us, you can call us at 484-588-5656 and leave a voicemail with your name, where you're from, and your question or comment. Please note, we may use your recorded voice in an upcoming episode of Cross Connections. If you like what you hear, we'd love if you would share this with your friends and rate us in Spotify and Apple Podcasts or whatever other app you're using so people can find us as well. Don't forget to visit our show notes for the year's reading list and any other resource links we've mentioned. Cross Connections is a ministry of St. David's Episcopal Church in Wayne, Pennsylvania. Season 2 Cover to Cover is hosted by
Rick Morley.
Elliot Van Hoy.
And Natalie Hill. Logo graphic design and podcast production by Natalie Hill. Stock media music provided by Marscott and Mood Mode Pond 5. You're welcome to learn more about all of St. David's worship and ministries at stdavidschurch.org.